October 4th, 1918. The Argonne Forest burned. The morning sun never broke through the smoke. What should have been dawn looked like the end of the world. Trees were shattered into splinters, their blackened trunks jutting out like broken bones from the mud. The air was thick with the stench of cordite and decay, a choking mix of earth, blood, and burning wood. Somewhere deep inside that inferno, hundreds of American soldiers were pinned down, their uniforms soaked in rain and fear. The Great War was nearing its final act, but no one here could feel victory. Northern France had become a graveyard of ambition, miles of barbed wire tangled across craters, machine guns echoing like thunder, and bodies half buried in the muck. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest operation in American history, had begun only days earlier. More than 1 million men were thrown into the forest, ordered to break the German lines once and for all. But this forest, dense, twisted, and endless, swallowed men whole. Major Charles Whittlesey led his battalion of the 77th Division through that nightmare. Most of his men were from New York, clerks, tailors, factory workers, now turned soldiers. They advanced farther than anyone expected, pushing deep into enemy territory. Maps said support would follow, but maps lied. German forces closed in behind them, cutting off every path of retreat. And when Whittlesey tried to call for help, there was only static, confusion, and silence. By midday they realized the unthinkable. They were surrounded. No food, no water, no reinforcements, only endless gunfire echoing from every direction. Worse, their own artillery, unaware of the mistake, began to rain shells on them. Explosions ripped through the hillside, tearing apart men who had survived days of fighting. Every attempt to signal their position failed. Field telephones were useless. Runners never made it through. The only thing that could carry a message beyond those burning trees had feathers. Messenger pigeons, small, fragile birds trained to fly through chaos, to deliver coordinates or orders across miles of open sky. The men joked about them before, called them mascots, pets, useless against bullets and gas. But now, in the choking mud of the Argonne, they were the battalion's last hope. The first bird was released, gone in seconds. The next was shot down before clearing the ridge. Feathers fell like ash. One by one, every attempt ended the same. Desperation turned to disbelief. The enemy was invisible, the forest unrecognizable, and death came from their own side. Some soldiers began writing letters home, folding them carefully into pockets they knew might never be opened. Others just stared at the horizon, waiting for something, anything, to break the pattern of explosions. Major Whittlesey refused to surrender. He ordered another message to be written, coordinates, a plea to stop the friendly fire, to hold position until help arrived. When his men looked at him, he simply said, "We'll send it again." They reached for one last pigeon. She was small, grey and scarred from previous missions. Her leg was bandaged, her eyes bright but tired. The name painted on her cage read, Cher Ami, dear friend. No one believed she could make it through the smoke, through the bullets, through the hell the sky had become. And yet, as the sound of mortars filled the forest and shrapnel tore through branches above, a soldier raised his trembling hand and set her free. Wings beat against the wind. In that instant, between one heartbeat and the next, the fate of 500 men left the ground, carried by a creature no heavier than a child's glove. How could a single bird decide the outcome of a battle that had already consumed millions? The Argonne would soon find out. They called them the 77th Division, a patchwork of young men from New York's crowded boroughs, sons of immigrants who had traded factory smoke for gunpowder and fear. They were nicknamed the Metropolitan Division, city boys thrown into a foreign forest that reeked of death. Some had never seen a field before France, and now they slept in mud that swallowed boots and memories alike. It was October of 1918, the final autumn of the Great War. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had begun days earlier, and it was already becoming the bloodiest campaign the United States had ever fought. More than 1 million Americans were pushing against the German lines in northern France, determined to crush an army that had held Europe hostage for 4 long years. The command believed it would be quick, a decisive push that would break the stalemate. But in the Argonne Forest, quick didn't exist. The terrain was a labyrinth of ravines and ridges, where every step forward meant climbing over wire, corpses, or both. Trees were so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Visibility was almost nothing. Machine guns hidden among the shadows turned every clearing into a killing zone. The Germans had fortified the forest for years, bunkers, tunnels, interlocking lines of fire, and the Americans were walking straight into it. Major Charles Whittlesey was a quiet man, a lawyer before the war, known for his sharp mind and calm under pressure. His command, roughly 500 men of the 77th. They were told to advance through the forest, to take a ridge and hold it until reinforcements arrived. Orders were simple. Reality was not. On the morning of October 2nd, Whittlesey's men pushed deeper into the woods, expecting the neighboring units to move alongside them, but communication was chaos. Maps were outdated, coordinates unreliable, and the fog of war turned direction itself into a lie. As the Major's battalion moved forward, other units stalled. Within hours, Whittlesey's men were isolated, further north than anyone else in the division. At first, they didn't know it. Gunfire echoed from every side, and the noise made it impossible to tell friend from foe. But by nightfall, the truth became clear. The Germans had closed in behind them, cutting off supply routes and lines of retreat. The Americans had advanced too far. They were now surrounded. Rain began to fall, steady and cold. Trenches turned into shallow graves of mud. The men had carried rations for 2 days. By the third, most were gone. Water had to be gathered from shell holes, thick with oil and blood. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Wounded soldiers were left lying where they fell, whispering for medics who couldn't reach them. Whittlesey tried to send runners through the forest to deliver messages back to headquarters. None returned. The forest had swallowed them whole. Cut off from the world, the battalion clung to its only thread of connection, the messenger pigeons. Dozens had been brought in wicker cages, trained to return to their lofts behind the lines. They were small, grey, ordinary birds, carrying scraps of paper that meant the difference between life and death. Each message was written by hand. Coordinates, reports, pleas for support. Each bird was released into a sky heavy with smoke and shrapnel, and each one vanished, cut down by German rifles or torn apart by the artillery storms that never stopped. By the 4th day, the men were starving. They ate what they could find, bits of bark, leaves, even worms. The rainwater they drank made them sick. Sleep came in seconds between barrages. The forest was alive with noise, the hiss of gas shells, the metallic hum of bullets, and the distant screams that never stopped echoing. And then came the worst blow, the unmistakable sound of friendly fire. American artillery, unaware of the battalion's position, began shelling the ridge. Explosions erupted all around them. Men screamed, shouting for it to stop. The radio was useless, the field phone destroyed, the runners dead. Only one way remained to reach their own army, through the sky. Major Whittlesey wrote a message with trembling hands. It was short, direct, desperate. He gave the coordinates and begged the artillery to stop firing. The note was placed inside a small metal capsule tied to a pigeon's leg. The bird was released, flapping frantically upward through smoke and gunfire. For a few seconds it seemed to vanish. Then a burst of gunfire, and it fell. Another bird gone. Men turned their faces away, unable to watch. Hope was thinning, like the air they breathed. Every passing hour felt longer than a lifetime. The forest, once an obstacle, had become their prison. And yet, despite the hunger, the exhaustion, the rain that never stopped, the battalion held its ground. No one surrendered. They fought with what little they had, rifles jammed with mud, bayonets dull from use, and a faith that someone, somewhere, knew they were still alive. Deep inside that choking forest, 500 men clung to existence by a thread of feathers and courage. Each time a pigeon was released, they looked upward as if praying to something invisible. One of those birds still waited in her cage, the smallest of them all, grey and calm, watching through the wire as if she understood. Her name was Cher Ami, and soon she would fly into history. The forest shook as though the earth itself had gone mad. Shell after shell tore through the hillside, shredding trees, throwing soil into the air like ocean spray. The Americans screamed for it to stop. Not the Germans' fire this time, but their own. The coordinates sent hours earlier had been misunderstood. The artillery batteries behind them, blind to the truth, were raining death on the very men they were supposed to protect. Major Charles Whittlesey crouched inside a shallow trench, mud clinging to his face, his uniform soaked with rain and blood. Around him, the remnants of his command huddled beneath shattered logs, their helmets dented, their nerves stretched to breaking. Each explosion lifted the ground under their feet, a concussion that drove dirt into their lungs. The forest smelled of sulphur, iron and rot. They had tried everything. Runners, mirrors, shouts through the chaos. Nothing reached headquarters. The radio lines were gone, cut by artillery or buried under fallen trees. The only lifeline left was the wicker cage that sat half-buried beside Whittlesey's boot. Inside, the pigeons fluttered and cooed, restless from the endless thunder overhead. "Get another message ready," the major ordered, his voice calm, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. A corporal knelt beside him, writing quickly on a small pad. The paper trembled with each distant impact. The note was simple. "We are under fire from our own artillery. For heaven's sake, stop it." Coordinates followed, scribbled with what little light filtered through the smoke. The words were brief but desperate, a cry for mercy disguised as military protocol. Whittlesey checked it once, nodded, and placed the folded paper into a small metal capsule. A young private lifted the first pigeon. Its wings quivered as he tied the message to its leg. "Godspeed," someone muttered. The bird shot into the air with a rush of feathers darting through the fog. For a second, the men dared to believe. Then came the crack of rifles. The sky above the ridge flashed. Feathers burst outward like snowflakes in the smoke. The bird spiraled down, lifeless, disappearing among the broken branches. Silence followed. The men stared upward, speechless, their faces pale beneath the grime. They had watched comrades die before, by bullet, by shell, by hunger. But watching a creature so small vanish in that instant left a different kind of wound. It was as if hope itself had been shot out of the sky. "Send another," Whittlesey said quietly. The corporal obeyed. A second pigeon. The same message, the same sky, the same fate. Feathers drifted down again, landing in the mud beside a fallen helmet. One soldier reached out, picked up a single grey plume, and tucked it into his pocket without a word. Hours passed, but time in the Argonne had no meaning anymore. The bombardment came in waves, unpredictable, cruel. Men clung to the ground when they heard the distant whistle, praying the next shell would fall somewhere else. The forest floor was scattered with bodies, some breathing, some not. Every sound, even the chirp of a distant bird, made them flinch. By late afternoon, Whittlesey's battalion had shrunk to a shadow of itself. They had begun with nearly 500 men. Now barely 200 could still fight. Some were wounded, others delirious. A few simply stared into nothing, lips moving in silent prayer. The major gathered his officers. Mud streaked every face. No one looked like a soldier anymore, only survivors waiting for the next mistake. "Sir," a lieutenant whispered, "we're killing our own men." Whittlesey's jaw tightened. "I know." He looked again at the cage. Only one pigeon remained. Cher Ami. She was smaller than the rest, feathers dulled by soot, one leg bandaged where shrapnel had grazed her days earlier. She had flown through gunfire before and returned, wounded but alive. The men respected her in a quiet, almost superstitious way. Still, the thought of sending her now, through this, felt like betrayal. "It's suicide for the bird," one private murmured, shaking his head. No one disagreed. The major didn't respond. He knelt beside the cage, opened the small door, and reached in. Cher Ami fluttered weakly against his hand, her body trembling but her eyes sharp. She seemed to know what was coming. Whittlesey turned to his sergeant. "Write it again." The sergeant scribbled on another scrap of paper. "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He folded it carefully, slid it into the capsule, and tied it to the bird's injured leg. A shell exploded close by, showering them with mud. The men ducked instinctively. When the smoke cleared, Whittlesey stood. "Release her," he said. The private hesitated, clutching the bird against his chest. "Sir, she won't make it." "Maybe not," Whittlesey replied, "but she's all we've got." The soldier nodded once, then lifted his hand. Cher Ami took off in a burst of motion, her wings slicing through the smoke. The men watched her rise, a streak of grey against the burning sky. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. German snipers spotted the movement and opened fire. Bullets whipped through the air, snapping branches, cutting leaves in half. For a moment she vanished behind a curtain of smoke. Then a flash of silver as the sunlight caught her wings. She was still flying, higher and higher, angling toward the American lines. The men below held their breath. Every heartbeat felt like an eternity. One soldier whispered, "Come on, girl, come on." More gunfire. A puff of feathers drifted down. Someone cursed under his breath, but still she flew. Whittlesey stood motionless, eyes fixed upward. The roar of the battle faded in his mind. All he could see was that fragile shape moving through the chaos, carrying everything they had left: faith, fear, and a piece of paper no bigger than a child's hand. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The last thing anyone saw was a tiny dot vanishing beyond the ridge, swallowed by smoke and distance. The forest fell silent, save for the distant rumble of artillery. The men waited, unsure whether to hope or give up entirely. Someone muttered, "She's gone." Whittlesey didn't answer. He just sat down on the edge of the trench, staring at the cage now empty beside him. Above them, the sky turned darker, thick with ash and rain. The explosions grew faint, scattered. Then, after a long, impossible pause, the shelling stopped. No one spoke. They looked at each other, dazed, afraid to believe. For the first time in days there was no thunder, no smoke, no death falling from the sky. Only the hiss of wind through burned trees and the soft patter of rain on torn helmets. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a bird, broken, bleeding, half-blind, was still flying. And because of her, 500 men would live to see another dawn. Cher Ami burst from the soldier's hand like a spark from a dying flame, vanishing into the choking fog that hung over the Argonne. For a heartbeat, her wings caught a shaft of pale light filtering through the smoke, a flash of silver against a sky the color of gunmetal. Then the air erupted. Rifles cracked from the German lines below. Machine guns swept the horizon, stitching trails of fire through the mist. The air screamed with lead. Each bullet sliced through the smoke with a hiss like tearing paper. The soldiers on the ground ducked, covering their heads as they watched the fragile outline of the bird twist and jolt through the chaos. "She's hit," someone shouted. But she wasn't falling, not yet. Cher Ami climbed higher, the sound of her wings nearly lost beneath the thunder of artillery. The forest below burned, each explosion lighting her from beneath like flashes of lightning. Branches fell, dirt flew skyward, and the smoke rolled in thick black waves. Somewhere behind her, 500 men waited, pinned in the mud, their lives tied to the tiny message now strapped to her leg. The first bullet struck her breast, ripping through the soft feathers and flesh beneath. Pain exploded through her body, hot, searing, unimaginable. For an instant, her wings faltered. The air around her spun, but instinct overpowered agony. She steadied herself, forcing her body upward, beating against the wind with what strength remained. Another shot. The second bullet tore through her leg, shattering the thin bone. Blood streamed down, staining her grey plumage dark red. The message capsule swung wildly from the wounded limb, hanging by the last threads of muscle and skin. Below, the forest dissolved into fire and smoke, a storm of shrapnel and screams, and still she flew. She flew past the lines where the Germans fired upward, their rifles tracking her as if she were a ghost crossing the heavens. She flew through no man's land, a wasteland of craters filled with water and bodies. Every gust carried the scent of decay, of wet earth and iron. Shells burst around her, the shock waves twisting her in mid-air, but somehow she found balance again. To the soldiers below, it was chaos. To her, it was motion, the pure, terrible rhythm of survival. Each beat of her wings was a defiance of the world trying to erase her. The ground was noise and fury. The sky, even amidst its violence, held a strange, fragile silence. Time stretched. She crossed over the enemy lines, the sound of the guns fading behind her, replaced by the deeper roar of distant artillery, the very guns that were killing her own soldiers. She pushed onward, flying blind through a world of drifting smoke and shattered trees. The wind buffeted her, dragging at her wounded wing. Her vision blurred, one eye clouded with blood. She couldn't see the horizon anymore, only light and shadow, the vague pull of instinct leading her home. Minutes felt like hours. Her breath came shallow and ragged. Each heartbeat was a drum of pain. She flew lower now, skimming the treetops, her wings brushing leaves still burning from the bombardment. She was nearly spent, her strength slipping away with every stroke. But something in her, some quiet command beyond thought, kept her moving. Behind the front lines, at the American command post, men shouted orders and pointed toward the ridge. They had no idea that salvation was coming through the smoke. A lookout caught sight of a small, erratic movement in the sky. Too small for a plane, too steady for debris. "It's one of ours!" he yelled. The others looked up. There, barely visible through the haze, came a pigeon, wings uneven, feathers torn, flying like something possessed. She wavered once, twice, as if the air itself might swallow her, then forced herself onward. Every few seconds she seemed to drop, only to rise again with desperate effort. Her path zigzagged through the barrage like a thread pulled through chaos. And then, finally, the guns behind the lines fell silent for a moment. A single shape darted over the trenches, moving fast and low. Cher Ami. She hit the ground hard, tumbling across the mud in a blur of feathers. One wing bent beneath her. The message tube thudded against the earth. A medic ran forward, scooping her up gently. Blood covered her chest. One leg hung by a thin strand of tissue, the capsule still attached. Her right eye was gone, blinded by shrapnel. "She's alive!" the medic gasped. They carried her to the command post, shouting for an officer. The message was pulled from her leg and read aloud. "We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Within minutes, the order spread through the ranks. Batteries recalibrated their coordinates. The guns that had been killing the trapped soldiers fell silent. For the first time in days, the Argonne Forest exhaled. Miles away, Whittlesey and his men felt the silence descend. It was so sudden, so absolute, that no one spoke. They looked at each other in disbelief. No more shells, no more friendly fire. Only the steady hum of the forest, the whisper of wind through burnt trees, the distant crackle of flames dying in the mud. "Did she make it?" someone whispered. Whittlesey didn't answer. He didn't have to. Somewhere inside him, he already knew. At the command post, Cher Ami lay in a medic's hands, her body trembling, heartbeat weak but steady. They tried to stop the bleeding, to save what was left of her shattered leg. She refused food, refused water. Yet even as her body failed, her eyes, the one that still saw, stayed fixed on the horizon, as if she could still feel the battalion waiting for her message to reach them. It had taken her 25 minutes to cross the inferno, 25 minutes through bullets, gas, and fire. When the report reached headquarters, men who had never met her stood in stunned silence. They had seen bravery in countless forms, but this was something else. A creature too small to understand orders had done what entire armies could not. Somewhere in that burned forest, hundreds of soldiers lifted their faces to a grey sky, now strangely quiet. Their savior was not a man with a rifle or a general with a map. It was a bird, bloodied, broken, still alive. And because she had flown through hell, they would live. The guns had fallen silent, but the forest still trembled. Smoke lingered over the ridges like ghosts refusing to leave. When the last echoes of artillery faded, the men of Major Whittlesey's battalion lay in stunned quiet, unsure whether to trust the silence. For days they had lived beneath an unbroken storm of fire, their own army's shells tearing apart the trees above them, the enemy pressing from every side. Now, suddenly, it was over. At first, no one dared to move. They listened, waiting for the next explosion, the next crack of rifle fire. But there was nothing. Only the hiss of rain falling through the leaves and the distant murmur of wind. The absence of sound was almost unbearable. Whittlesey looked around at what was left of his command. Men who had once marched in perfect formation now sat slumped against trees, their faces hollow and streaked with soot. Mud covered everything, uniforms, weapons, even their skin. Some had gone days without speaking. Others mumbled prayers under their breath. A few didn't speak at all. And then, faintly at first, came another sound. Engines, voices, the clatter of gear. American troops were moving through the forest. The message carried by Cher Ami had reached headquarters. The coordinates had led them here. The rescue began cautiously, soldiers advancing through the trees, calling out through the smoke. Whittlesey, 77th Division. At first, the trapped men thought it was another trick, another echo of madness. But the voices grew louder, closer, human. When the first rescuers broke through the tree line, what they found hardly looked like soldiers. The men of the Lost Battalion emerged one by one, limping, bleeding, dazed. Out of nearly 500 who had gone in, 197 could still stand. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Their uniforms hung loose on skeletal frames. Some carried their injured comrades over their shoulders. Others leaned on rifles like crutches. Their eyes had the glassy, distant look of those who had seen too much. A corporal, covered in grime, raised his hand weakly when he saw the rescuers. "About time," he rasped. His voice cracked, dry from thirst. The rescuers moved quickly, sharing canteens, tearing open ration packs. Medics wrapped bandages, splinted limbs, wiped mud from faces that hardly looked alive. A few men began to cry without sound, the tears mixing with the rain. They had endured starvation, thirst, exhaustion, and the unending fear of friendly fire. Now, standing in the grey drizzle of the Argonne, they were alive, but changed forever. Whittlesey stood among them, motionless, his expression unreadable. When a captain from the relief force saluted him, he barely acknowledged it. His men were the only thing that mattered now. He walked slowly between them, counting under his breath, his lips trembling. For every living man he recognized, there were 3 he didn't. The forest floor was a graveyard, the cost of a map error, a line crossed too far. Back at the command post, word of the rescue spread fast. The message that had stopped the bombardment had been written in Whittlesey's own hand. The pigeon that delivered it, the tiny survivor called Cher Ami, was now a patient herself. She lay on a table in the field hospital, surrounded by medics. Her chest wound was deep, one leg nearly severed, her feathers stiff with blood. A surgeon, the same kind who had treated countless soldiers, worked over her with tweezers and thread. They used iodine, stitched her flesh carefully, and wrapped her leg in gauze. When they were finished, she was placed in a small box lined with straw and warmth. The men who visited her did so quietly, as though entering a chapel. Some touched the side of the box gently, others left small crumbs of bread beside her. She had saved their brothers, their friends, their commander. They spoke her name in whispers, Cher Ami, dear friend. Word travelled through the ranks faster than any official report. Within days, stories spread along the front lines, of a pigeon that flew through fire, wounded, blinded, carrying a message that saved 200 lives. French officers sent gifts to the American camp. British soldiers wrote home about the bird that beat death. Even hardened veterans who had seen every horror the war could offer found something sacred in the tale. Cher Ami became a living symbol, proof that courage could exist in any form. Amid the noise of artillery and the brutality of the trenches, her story gave men something to believe in. Meanwhile, the survivors of the Lost Battalion were moved to a rear camp for treatment. They slept in real beds for the first time in days, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Some couldn't stop flinching at sudden noises. Others woke screaming, reliving the barrage. The doctors called it shell shock, but the men simply said they couldn't forget. Whittlesey sat alone that night, staring into the flicker of a lantern. His uniform was still caked in mud, his eyes dark from sleeplessness. The victory felt hollow. He had followed orders, held his ground, and his men had survived, but at a cost that could never be counted. The forest still echoed in his head. The screams, the rain, the sound of a pigeon's wings beating against impossible odds. Outside, the camp had gone quiet. The rain had stopped. Somewhere beyond the tents, a medic checked on Cher Ami, gently placing a drop of water near her beak. Her chest rose and fell weakly. Her bandaged leg twitched. She was alive. In the days that followed, she became the most famous patient in the army. Generals visited her cage, reporters took photographs, and soldiers who'd never heard of the Lost Battalion learned her name. Letters arrived from across France, some from nurses, others from soldiers at the front, each calling her a hero. But for those who had been trapped in the Argonne, the legend was more than a story. They had seen the impossible. They had watched her vanish into smoke and return salvation. And when they remembered those days of terror, it wasn't the sound of guns they recalled first. It was the faint flutter of wings disappearing into the storm. Weeks later, the survivors marched in silence through a ruined village. Their boots splashed through puddles, their faces expressionless. Civilians watched them pass, whispering that these were the men who had been lost and found again. The soldiers carried their banner, stained, torn, but still standing. Behind them, Cher Ami was carried carefully in her box, resting on the lap of a medic who refused to let her out of sight. To him, and to every man who had been there, she wasn't just a bird. She was proof that even in the darkest corner of war, something small and fragile could still defy death. By the time they reached the rear lines, the story had already become legend. Commanders spoke of it in briefings. Soldiers retold it at campfires. In a war built on machines and madness, a single pigeon had reminded them all that courage wasn't a matter of rank or size. It was the will to keep moving when everything else said stop. The men of the Lost Battalion had been rescued, but it was Cher Ami who had truly carried them home. The war ended not with a single explosion, but with a silence that rolled across Europe like a wave. When the guns finally stopped in November of 1918, the world stood stunned, as if unsure how to breathe without the thunder of artillery. Millions were gone, swallowed by mud, gas, and metal. The great empires that had ruled for centuries lay in ruins. Humanity had built machines powerful enough to level cities, but it was not steel or strategy that had saved the men of the Lost Battalion. It was a bird. That irony became a whisper across the ranks, passed from trench to trench, from campfire to campfire. In an age of tanks and poison gas, of roaring planes and mechanical death, the symbol of hope was something barely the weight of a soldier's glove. A creature without armor, without rank, without reason to understand war, yet somehow more courageous than all the noise around her. While generals received medals and nations debated treaties, Cher Ami recovered slowly under the care of army medics. She never flew again. The bullet that had torn through her chest had damaged one lung. Her leg, barely saved by the surgeon's careful stitching, healed crooked and stiff. Still, she lived. Her cage sat near the medical tents, surrounded by flowers and small offerings from passing soldiers, crumbs of bread, shiny buttons, scraps of ribbon. Some saluted her, others just stood quietly, unsure how to thank her for what she had done. In early 1919, the French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre, their Medal of Bravery, for carrying her message through fire and blood. When the ribbon was placed beside her cage, she turned her head slightly, as if to study it, and then tucked her beak beneath her wing. The soldiers laughed softly, calling her modest. News of her story spread beyond the front lines, crossing oceans faster than any telegram. Newspapers in New York and Chicago printed her name in bold letters, Cher Ami, the pigeon who saved an army. Children in classrooms learned about her flight through hell. Veterans wept when they read how she had delivered the message that stopped the friendly fire. For a weary world searching for meaning after so much loss, she became more than an animal. She was a reminder that even in war, compassion and courage could still exist. But time, as always, moved on. By June of 1919, Cher Ami's wounds began to fail her. She grew weaker each day, her breath slower, her feathers thin and pale. The medics did what they could, but her body had given all it had to give long before the world found peace. One morning, she closed her eyes and did not wake. The soldiers buried her with care before her body was sent to the United States, where taxidermists preserved her for history. When they placed her in the Smithsonian, they left one detail untouched, the tiny metal capsule still tied to her damaged leg, the same one that had carried Whittlesey's message through the smoke of the Argonne. Inside that capsule, the words remained unchanged. For heaven's sake, stop it. Visitors who walk through the Smithsonian today sometimes stop in front of her case, unsure what to feel. The bird is small, almost delicate, her feathers frozen mid-motion, her glass eyes catching the light. Beneath her nameplate, the inscription reads, "The pigeon who saved the Lost Battalion." Children press their hands to the glass. Veterans stand in silence. Few realize that the faint scratches on her leg once marked the edge of a battlefield. It is hard to imagine now, a war of millions halted, if only for a moment, by a creature that never understood the orders she carried. Historians write about tactics, maps, and generals, but the truth lingers in quieter corners of memory. The story of Cher Ami was not about victory or defeat. It was about endurance, the small, unyielding will to keep moving forward through impossible pain. The soldiers who survived the Argonne carried her memory for the rest of their lives. Some kept her photograph beside medals. Others spoke of her when words about the war itself failed them. To them, she was not a legend. She was the heartbeat that refused to stop when everything else did. As decades passed, the world built newer wars, newer machines, each deadlier than the last. Yet none erased the strange, simple truth of that autumn day in 1918, that courage can wear feathers, that heroism sometimes fits inside a creature smaller than a soldier's hand. Cher Ami had no uniform, no country, no orders to obey. She carried no hatred, no fear of dying. All she carried was a message, one that saved lives and somehow reminded the world of its own humanity. Now she stands eternal behind the glass of the museum, her form preserved, her story whispered to each new visitor. Light glints off the metal tube still tied to her leg. Somewhere beyond that silent case, the echoes of her wings still seem to move, across the forest, across time, across memory itself. In the end, she became what every soldier hopes to be, not forgotten. And as the years fold into history, her image remains, still watching, still waiting, still bearing the weight of a single desperate note that once stopped the fire of a world gone mad. In the museum's glass, she still watches over them, the soldier who never held a rifle, yet carried an army's last hope.